Hi, good afternoon, Saints. I want to do a quick video on why every local church should have an evangelism ministry, that is a street evangelism ministry, and why local churches need to reach their communities with the gospel. And I'm just going to quickly read a few scriptures here. This is from Mark 16:15. I'm sure most of us are familiar with this verse. It's considered along with Matthew 28, the last few verses. It's called the Great Commission. And I'm just going to quickly read it. It says, "And he said unto them, Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." Now Christ is telling this to his immediate apostles right before he ascends into heaven. He gives them this great command, this great commission, to go into all the world and to preach the gospel to every creature. Now, this command, in the immediate context, it applies to the apostles, but it didn't just end with the apostles, and we do see this carried over into the book of Acts with the early church. And many in the early church, especially if you read the book of Acts, were actually heavily involved in evangelism. And we have ordinary saints just going around and preaching the gospel. One of those was Philip the evangelist in Acts chapter 8. He went around and he was just an ordinary believer, and even was one of the deacons in Acts chapter 6. A few chapters back, he was counted as one of the first deacons of the church. And he also was an evangelist, and he went around preaching the gospel everywhere he went. And as we see, the command here is also given to all the church. And I'm going to skip ahead to the Epistle of Romans. I'm going to go to the Epistle of Romans chapter 10. So chapter 10, this is verses 14. I'm going to read down to 17. It says, "How then shall they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how shall they hear, and how shall they believe in him of whom they have not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? And how shall they preach except they be sent? As it is written, How beautiful are the feet of them that preach the gospel of peace, and bring glad tidings of good things. But they have not all obeyed the gospel. For ye see, as saith, Lord, who hath believed our report? So then faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God." Now Paul is talking to a local church, or even several local churches in Rome. And he says, how shall the people hear, the unbeliever hear, unless there's a preacher being sent to them and they're preaching the gospel? And often believers have the view that a preacher is simply the man behind the pulpit, the pastor, and it's just simply not true. To preach means to proclaim. It means to say something with conviction. It means to say something with conviction, to proclaim, in other words. That's what a preacher is. And Paul here calls all Christians preachers. He says, how shall they hear without a preacher? Except they be sent. How shall they preach? Except they be sent. Now, this does not simply mean only missionaries, but Paul is actually calling all the saints here preachers. And he even says, and even quotes an Old Testament passage, I believe in the book of Isaiah, "As it is written, How beautiful are the feet of them that preach the gospel of peace and bring glad tidings of good things." So Paul is saying that the beautiful feet are of those who preach the gospel of peace. In other words, the good news of Jesus Christ. And this is something that all churches need to be involved in, local churches. And unfortunately, many local churches are not reaching their communities because they're doing a lot of in-reach with a lot of fellowship within their own selves and their own chapels, and a lot of programs within themselves, but there's not enough outreach being done by many local churches. And I'm going to go to Luke 10. So Luke chapter 10, and some of you may be familiar with this these few verses I'm about to read. So chapter 10 says it says, "After these things the Lord appointed other 70 also, and sent them 2 and 2 before his face into every city and place whither he himself would come. Verse 2, "Therefore said he unto them, The harvest truly is great, but the laborers are few. Pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest, that he would send forth laborers into his harvest." So Jesus is here appointing 70 of his disciples, and he sent them 2 and 2, so by pairs, into places, into the cities and towns. And he says here that this harvest truly is great, but the laborers are few. And he says, "Pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest, that he would send forth laborers into the harvest." This was true in Jesus' day, but it's also true in our day, that the harvest truly is plenteous. The harvest is great and it's ready, but the laborers are few. And this was true in Jesus' day, but it's also very, very true in our day. Many local churches are not reaching the lost in their own communities. It seems like every local church wants to focus on doing overseas missions, and they have too much of their focus on overseas, but there's not a lot of focus of getting the good news to the lost in their own communities. And it's actually a fact that most local churches are actually not reaching their own communities. And for just to give an example, in our town, we live in a very small university town in Northern California, so it's a small town, so there isn't very many areas to do evangelisms other than just the downtown area and then the university campus where there's a lot of people. But I've been out here for a few years now, and I have not seen any other local church evangelizing the lost. It would be nice to see more and more churches out in their communities and actually reaching their own lost within their own communities. But there isn't very many local churches, and it's important that local churches have an evangelism ministry where there's actually not just only inreach taking place within the church life, but also doing outreach. And people talk about revival, but nobody wants to go out and do evangelism. If you look at history, church history, evangelism or revivals didn't happen if Christians did not go out and evangelize the lost. Like if you see the Jesus movement in church history back in the 60s, in the Calvary Chapel movement, of which I'm part of, there was revival took place because a lot of the hippies, most of them were hippies, went out and evangelized the lost. So there was a lot of, that's how the revival movement at that time exploded, because many of these newer converts were going out and reaching other hippies and reaching other people in their communities, and it led to a massive revival. It goes back even to the Great Awakening era with John Wesley, George Whitefield. They went out and evangelized, and that's what led to great revivals, because these men followed and obeyed the Great Commission. Doesn't mean they were perfect, but they followed and obeyed the Great Commission, which is why these revivals took place. There can be no revival unless Christians start going out into their communities and sharing the good news with the people around them. It's not enough just to give money to missions in our local churches, but it's actually something that should be done by all of us. And if you don't have a street evangelism ministry, I would consider talking to your pastor, and you guys can set one up. Set a time and a day, maybe during the week or once a month, and start one. And it's also a good encouragement to the church members to start to encourage them to go out and evangelize with that church evangelism ministry. And to not evangelize the lost is actually a sin. And when local churches are not don't have a street evangelism ministry where there's no evangelism taking place, then that is a disobedience to the Great Commission, and it is a sin, because Jesus wants us to go and evangelize the lost. He says here that the laborers are few, and that was true in his day, but it's also true in our day that the laborers are still few. And if you're one of the believers that are actually active in evangelism, then I commend you for that, because very, very few believers, let alone churches, local churches even, are involved in evangelism, and it's a sad thing. So if you don't have a street evangelism ministry in your local church, I would talk to your pastor to get one started. And if there's no evangelism training going on, then if there's nobody there to teach per se, because some local churches have evangelism training going on because somebody is actually teaching classes, then the next best alternative is to buy an evangelism book and then go through it as a church, and somebody can lead the study and then take turns leading the studies as a local church. And you guys go through it that way, and everybody is being trained at the same time. So that's another alternative if there's nobody per se to teach in your local church on evangelism. But we should all be praying that the Lord, to the Father, that he would send forth more laborers, because we definitely need more laborers into the harvest. The harvest has been ready since the time of Jesus Christ, even when he was sending already the 70 disciples here. And the harvest is still ready and is great, but we need more laborers into the harvest. So I encourage you, if you don't have a street evangelism ministry in your local church, talk to your pastor and get one set up, and you should lead that. So I encourage you to go ahead and do that. So thank you for watching. God bless.